The problem of divine hiddenness. The problem of divine hiddenness. Premise 0, God exists. Premise 1, if God exists, then he would not, Premise 1, if God exists, then he would have all men believe in him. Premise 2, but all persons do not believe in him. Premise 3, by 1 and 2, God does not exist. And the conclusion, number 4, 0 and 3 contradict one another. And I'll try to put these arguments in the description as well, so you'll have them in writing that you can look at all at once. So then, by reductio ad absurdum, the zeroth premise is false. In other words, God does not exist. That is the argument from divine hiddenness. By my lights, this atheistic argument is valid. If the premises are true, the conclusion must follow. Excuse me. But there is a catch. Just because this argument may be valid, that does not mean it is sound. We can focus our attention, then, on the truthfulness, or lack thereof, of the individual premises. The key premises are 1 and 2. 2 seems pretty clear, 1 less so. And again, premise 1 is, if God exists, then he would have all men believe in him. The idea expressed in premise 1 seems to be that God does require belief in him so that persons escape hell, and at the same time does not want anyone to go to hell. Well, I suppose this idea is true, but premise 1 entails more than just this. The problem is that the word belief is ambiguous. Saving belief includes an act of the will. God wants us to choose to follow him and believe in him. Can he make us freely choose to do something? Of course not. While God certainly is all-powerful, he cannot do the logically impossible. To say that omnipotence can do the logically impossible is to utter meaningless nonsense, is to speak meaningless nonsense. When the term belief is understood in this more precise sense, we see very clearly that whereas God wants all to believe in him, he does not and even cannot make all men freely choose him. The upshot of this is that premise 1 is false, and so the argument is, as a whole, unsound. The next atheistic argument, the meaninglessness of God talk. God is wholly other, or radically transcendent, or we could say that his love, for example, is qualitatively different from human love, as opposed to being merely quantitatively different from human love. And we understand what love is through observing love in ourselves and others, so we don't really have anything to compare God's love to, so we really can't speak meaningfully about that attribute or his other attributes. All God talk is, in a word, meaningless, in other words. This is not so much a proof against the existence of God as it is against the knowledge of God or against speech about God. The first problem with this view is that it is a misrepresentation of how many Christians view God. While we see God as transcendent, we do not see him as so radically transcendent as to be beyond being or beyond other human categories. Aside from this misunderstanding, is there any reason to suppose that God talk is, of necessity, meaningless? Yes, namely, if logical positivism is true. Logical positivists have said that for a truth claim to be meaningful, it must be capable of falsification by the 5 senses. Yet the principle of falsifiability is self-defeating, which is why most epistemologists today are not logical positivists. So the principle of falsifiability itself fails the principle of falsifiability. Even if we ignore the falsifiability criterion's self-referentiality, I don't think logical positivism possesses a serious threat to belief in God. For God's existence, or lack thereof, is in principle empirically falsifiable. For example, if we expect to find God's fingerprints in nature, but do not find them, that would falsify our belief that he exists. So this argument, which is really not an argument for atheism after all, is not a good one. We'll look next at the problem of evil, both deductive and inductively. Shalom. Thank you all. Have a great day. Bye now.